I'm Amanda Walker, 29, and I always thought I was meticulous about my finances. So when my phone buzzed with a bank notification about a pending $800,000 loan payment, I nearly dropped it. I was standing in line at the grocery store, eyes scanning the notification over and over, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. This had to be a mistake. I hadn't taken out any loan. After hours on hold with the bank, a representative finally confirmed the nightmare. The loan was real. Processed in my name. And the property address? A condo in a trendy part of the city, exactly where my husband Jeremy had been hinting we should invest for our future. Jeremy. My hands went cold. I was raised by accountants. My parents taught me the importance of clean credit and cautious spending. I had a perfect score, not a missed payment in my adult life. And now, an $800,000 liability was linked to my name, and I hadn't signed a thing. Jeremy came home that evening like nothing had happened. I waited until he took off his shoes before I said, "Is there something you need to tell me?" He blinked. Paused. Then said, "About what?" I watched his face closely. "The loan. The one in my name." His mouth tightened. He sat on the arm of the couch, rubbing his hands together like he always did when he was nervous. "I was going to tell you. I just needed more time. It's an investment." I felt something twist in my stomach. "You forged my signature." He didn't deny it. "I did it for us. Amanda, it's a sure thing. The market's about to explode in that neighborhood. I didn't want to miss it." I stared at him. The man I had married 4 years ago. The man I had trusted with everything. He continued, "We'll flip it in 6 months. Make double. I just needed your credit to get it through." I said nothing. That night, I slept on the couch. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. But something broke in me. Not just the trust, but something older, deeper. Something tied to years of being the responsible one, the one who paid bills on time, who read the fine print, who kept everything running while others took shortcuts. The next morning, I skipped work and drove to my parents' house. My mother made tea. My father sat quietly while I explained what happened. At the end, he said one sentence, "You need to protect yourself." I nodded. The weeks that followed were filled with cold silence. I consulted a lawyer. I reviewed the loan paperwork. Jeremy had used a copy of my signature from our mortgage documents and applied digitally. It would take time, but the lawyer said I had a strong case for fraud. Still, the damage was done. But I wasn't going to let this define me. Jeremy thought I would forgive him, like always. He underestimated how quietly a woman can begin to plan. What he didn't know was that I had been saving emails, financial statements, text messages, everything. And when he invited both our families over for dinner to announce a new investment strategy, I said nothing. I smiled. I served the wine. I let him talk. And then I told them all what he did. The silence at that table was heavier than any scream. Jeremy turned pale. His father looked furious. My own mother looked at me with something close to awe. I said, "There's a meeting with my lawyer on Thursday. I expect you to be there." Jeremy stammered, "You're overreacting." I looked at him for the last time like a wife. "I'm reacting just enough." He didn't come home that night. But I did. And I changed the locks. And that was just the beginning. The silence that followed filled the rooms like a gas leak, quiet, invisible, and suffocating. I moved through my apartment like a stranger in a borrowed life, unable to touch anything without remembering what it used to mean. The couch still smelled like him. The throw blanket he'd bought on our trip to Oregon still draped over the back, waiting to warm someone who wasn't coming back. I let it sit. Some things needed to remain untouched, if only to measure how far I'd come from being the woman who once cared what he liked. The worst part wasn't the loan. It was the fact that I hadn't been surprised. Hurt, yes. but not surprised. Somewhere along the line, Jeremy had stopped being a partner and become a liability. It didn't happen all at once. It was a slow erosion, like the coastline giving way to the tide. I only noticed it when the house we built together started to creak in the wind. He was charming. God, he knew how to light up a room. Everyone loved him. My friends called him a catch and told me how lucky I was. He'd make cocktails at dinner parties and laugh at the right jokes, pulling people in with that easy confidence that had once seduced me, too. But beneath that shine was a recklessness I had refused to name. I used to find receipts for impulse purchases tucked between pages of books. Credit card charges from bars I didn't know he went to. He once bought a motorcycle on a whim and sold it 3 months later when the novelty wore off. He called it passion. I called it lack of discipline. And still, I stayed. I stayed because I believed marriage was about compromise. Because he said he loved me, and sometimes he showed it. Because I was the practical one, and practical people fix things. They don't walk away just because it gets hard. But there comes a point where the fixing becomes a disguise for enabling. I thought about my grandmother, Elaine. She died 2 years ago, but her voice still lived in me. She once told me that a woman should never tie her identity to a man who gambles with her future. At the time, I thought she meant literal gambling. Now I understood. She had grown up poor and married a man who believed in working hard and dying young. He left her with 4 kids and a mortgage she couldn't afford. She took in laundry, rented out the garage, and paid off every cent herself. That kind of dignity doesn't come from luck. It comes from resolve. She left me her rings. A modest diamond set in a worn gold band. I hadn't worn it in years. That night, I took it out of the jewelry box. I didn't put it on. I just held it. The next morning, I called the bank again. I asked for a full audit of the loan file. The woman on the other end was sympathetic. Said she'd seen things like this before. Said most women didn't fight. I said, well, I do. After I hung up, I called my father. He said, you want me to come over? I paused. No. I just wanted to hear your voice. We talked for 14 minutes. It was the longest call we'd had in years. Afterward, I sat at my desk and pulled out the binder I kept for personal documents. Tucked in the back was a file labeled emergency. It held copies of my birth certificate, passport, will, and one more thing I had forgotten until now. A prenuptial agreement. Jeremy had refused to sign one. I had insisted. And now, holding that file in my hands, I remembered why I had trusted my instincts. Somewhere, beneath all the compromises and emotional labor, I had always known to leave myself a door. Now I planned to walk through it. Not with anger. Not with vengeance. With clarity. And that was the difference. I picked up my phone and scheduled a meeting with a forensic accountant. Then I texted Jeremy, I need the keys to the condo. Drop them off tomorrow by noon. Do not come inside. He replied within minutes, you're making a mistake. We can fix this. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. That evening, I sat on my balcony and watched the city lights flicker on. Somewhere out there was the condo he bought with my name, my credit, my future. But it wasn't mine. Not anymore. I wasn't chasing justice. I was reclaiming peace. And I was only just beginning to understand what that really meant. I hadn't realized how lonely strength could feel until I found myself fielding silence instead of support. The people who had once called us a golden couple vanished the moment things cracked. Even the mutual friends, especially them, acted like neutrality was virtue. I stopped hearing from Chloe, who used to invite me to yoga retreats and wine tastings. She texted once to say she hoped I could forgive Jeremy and find my way back to love. As if forgiveness was just a matter of deciding not to be hurt. I never replied. My inbox became a gallery of absences, unanswered messages from the lawyer, overdue updates from the bank. Progress came in shuffles, not strides. And in between, I worked. I buried myself in quarterly reports and budgeting plans, numbers that didn't lie, systems that still obeyed the rules. But even there, the edges frayed. At the firm, I noticed how people hesitated around me. Whispers stopped when I entered conference rooms. I'd become a cautionary tale, the woman who got caught in her husband's mess. The woman who let it happen. Never mind that I hadn't. Never mind that I was cleaning up something I didn't create. One afternoon, my supervisor pulled me into a side office. He closed the door, a tight smile on his face. He said, "We've been hearing concerns about your focus. A few clients have mentioned delays." I said, "Has my work been inaccurate?" He hesitated. "No. But the energy, your presence, it's felt different." I nodded. Noted the polite warning. The invitation to step aside if I couldn't hold it together. After he left, I stared at the wall for a long time. Then I sent an email to my only real friend at the firm, Lena. She replied 5 minutes later. "They're not wrong, Amanda. But they're not right, either. Want to talk?" That night, we met at a bar near the river. She brought wine. I brought honesty. Lena was blunt, in the way only someone who had earned the right could be. She said, "You've always carried too much. That doesn't mean you have to do it alone." I didn't cry. I just nodded. Let the silence settle between us like something sacred. Later, in bed, I stared at the ceiling and wondered how much of my life had been built on holding my breath. The next day, Jeremy dropped off the keys. He didn't knock. Just left them in a plain envelope with my name in his familiar scrawl. Inside, I found a note, "You're not the woman I married." He was right. That woman had believed love meant endurance. This one believed it meant accountability. The forensic accountant called the next morning. Her voice was crisp. She said, "You were right to come to us. We found some discrepancies." I asked, "Discrepancies or deception?" She replied, "You'll want to see this in person." I stood at the window after the call, watching the late October rain streak down the glass. Jeremy's betrayal hadn't been a single choice. It had been a pattern. One I had woven myself into without realizing. Now, I was unraveling it. One thread at a time. And I had just found the end of another. The documents were heavier than I expected. Not physically, they were digitized, printed neatly in a tabbed binder, but emotionally. Each page was another proof of how far Jeremy had gone without hesitation, without doubt. There were 4 properties in total. 3 I knew nothing about. 2 were in his name. 1 was in both of ours. 1 was solely mine. He hadn't just forged my signature. He'd forged a future I never agreed to live in. The forensic accountant laid it out calmly. Her voice never faltered. She said, "You could pursue criminal charges. There's enough here. But that will take time and cooperation from the DA." I asked, "What are my other options?" She said, "Civil action. Asset freeze. A full financial review." The phrase echoed, asset freeze. I looked at the charts, the names of shell LLCs, the cash transfers that didn't make sense until they did. Jeremy had always been slick with charm. Turns out, he was slick with money too. When I left the meeting, I didn't go home. I drove to the condo. The one that started it all. It was bare. No furniture. Just empty rooms and potential. I walked through slowly, heels clicking against tile. Every surface whispered what could have been. Open concept betrayal. Hardwood floors of deceit. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the sunlight streaking in through spotless windows. Then I did something I hadn't done in weeks. I let myself imagine. Not a life with Jeremy. Just a life without him. Back at home, I gathered what I needed. Passwords. Deeds. Credit reports. I called the lawyer and gave him authorization to proceed. I called the financial institutions and froze everything we still shared. And then, I called his mother. She answered with cautious politeness. I said, I thought you should know. Your son has been forging my name and laundering assets. I'm pursuing legal action. I'd appreciate if you didn't interfere. She was silent for a beat. Then she said, that sounds like something his father would have done. I said nothing. There was nothing left to say. I filed the fraud claim the next morning. The DA's office requested a formal interview. I showed up with everything. Names, timelines, records. The assistant DA blinked at the level of documentation. He said, most women don't come this prepared. I replied, most women don't see the storm coming until it's already hit. I've been watching the sky for months. Later, in the dark, I reread the text Jeremy had sent. We can fix this. But it was never broken. It was built wrong from the start. And now, I had blueprint in hand. A new foundation waiting to be poured. I slept for the first time in weeks. Deep. Dreamless. Uninterrupted. And in the morning, I woke up ready to begin construction. The invitation to the meeting wasn't mailed, texted, or whispered, it was served. Jeremy opened the door to a courier holding an envelope from my attorney's office. Inside, a formal notice to appear for arbitration regarding financial misconduct and property disputes. I knew he would call. He did. He said, this is ridiculous. We don't need lawyers. I replied, we've needed lawyers for a long time. You just didn't notice. The meeting was scheduled in a downtown office suite, glass walls, polished floors, a long table meant to look neutral but designed for control. I arrived 5 minutes early. My lawyer, Erica Green, greeted me with a calm nod. She wore no perfume, no jewelry. Just precision. Jeremy came in late. He looked tired. The charming facade was there, but dulled. His tie was crooked. His hands trembled when he sat down. Erica began. She said, we're here to resolve several financial discrepancies stemming from fraudulent actions carried out by Mr. Walker. Jeremy scoffed. I didn't steal anything. We're married. It was our money. Erica's voice didn't change. Your marriage does not give you legal right to forge documents or assume debt under your spouse's name. He turned to me. Amanda, come on. We can work this out. I didn't speak. I let the paperwork do it for me. Every lie he told was catalogued, timestamped, notarized. Loan documents. Transfer logs. Property records. Shell company flows. Digital footprints that could no longer be swept away by charm. I watched him read through them. At first, defiance. Then confusion. Then something closer to panic. He said, why are you doing this? I answered, because I owe myself more than endurance. The meeting lasted over 2 hours. At one point, his lawyer requested a recess. Erica refused. She said, Mr. Walker has had ample time to respond to these matters voluntarily. We're past recess. When we reached the matter of the condo title, I spoke again. I said, that property is in my name. The mortgage is tied to my credit. I'm selling it. The proceeds will go to pay down the fraudulent loan. What remains, I'm taking as restitution. Jeremy said, you can't just decide that. Erica said, she can. And she has. He turned red. He said, you're ruining my life. I said, you ruined it the day you forged my name. I'm just correcting the record. There was a long pause. His lawyer leaned in, whispered something. Jeremy nodded, reluctantly. Then he said, fine. What do you want? Just say it. I looked him in the eye. I want you to admit what you did. In writing. I want your acknowledgement. And I want you out of the way. No more calls. No more texts. You relinquish all claim to our assets, including those tied to my name. He laughed bitterly. You want a confession? I said, I want a boundary. The confession is your cost of crossing it. Erica slid a prepared statement across the table. Jeremy read it. His hands shook. He signed. No ceremony. No drama. Just ink on paper, the final note of a song that had played too long. When we stood to leave, he said, You think this makes you strong? I said nothing. Because strength doesn't need to announce itself. I stepped into the hallway, and the air felt cleaner than it had in months. On the elevator ride down, Erica turned to me. She said, You did well. Most people lose control in rooms like that. I replied, I've already lost enough. Control is all I have left. I walked out of that building lighter. Not free. Not yet. But lighter. Jeremy's signature wasn't the end. It was the doorway. Behind it, cleanup, closure, and the slow rebuild. And somewhere ahead, something I hadn't dared hope for in weeks. Peace. But first, I had one last name to remove from a deed. And I knew exactly when and where to do it. Freedom doesn't feel like fireworks. It feels like paperwork. The next week passed in forms and filings, notarized letters and account closings. I wasn't erasing Jeremy from my life, I was editing him out with meticulous strokes. The kind that didn't leave smudges. The condo sold quickly. Market demand was still high, and Erica handled everything through a discreet agent. The profit barely skimmed what we owed, but it was enough to cover the forged loan. Enough to end it. I received the wire transfer confirmation at 9:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. No fanfare. Just a number on a screen and a confirmation email with my full name typed correctly. That detail meant more than I expected. My name. My clean signature. My life, slowly mine again. Jeremy tried to reach out once after the arbitration. He sent a single message. He said, I still don't understand how we ended up like this. I didn't respond. Some questions don't deserve answers. The silence became my protection. At work, the tension eased. Lena kept me close, shielding where she could, speaking when I didn't want to. She never pitted me. That mattered. Pity assumes weakness. She saw something else. One afternoon, after a finance meeting, she said, You should take the weekend off. There's nothing left to prove. She was right. I drove out of the city that Friday. I didn't tell anyone. I just filled a bag, loaded the car, and followed the interstate north until the skyline disappeared. My grandmother's cottage sat on a quiet lake, 2 hours from the city. Untouched since her funeral. My father had kept the taxes paid, the roof repaired, but no one stayed long. Too many memories. Too much quiet. But quiet was what I needed. Inside, everything smelled of cedar and lavender. Her quilt still folded in the linen chest. Her handwriting still labeling the pantry jars. I unpacked slowly. Made tea. Built a fire I didn't really need. That night, I walked down to the dock barefoot. The lake was glass, moonlight fractured across it like a secret being whispered. I sat at the edge and let my legs dangle into the cold. I whispered nothing back. In the morning, I made a list. Not of tasks, of boundaries. No shared accounts. No unsigned documents. No apologies for caution. No man who mistook forgiveness for permission. It wasn't about Jeremy anymore. It was about remembering who I had been before compromise blurred the edges. I stayed 3 days. Long enough to breathe without flinching. When I returned, the city felt different. Not smaller, just sharper. Less like a maze, more like a grid. I went back to work, not with vengeance, but with focus. My performance improved. I smiled more, but I didn't explain myself. I stopped accepting meetings that could have been emails. I stopped carrying other people's silence. 3 weeks after the arbitration, Erica called. She said, "The DA decided not to pursue charges, but your civil claim holds. You'll be awarded restitution through asset division." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. She said, "You won, Amanda." But that wasn't how it felt. It felt like neutral. Like finally standing on solid ground after months of sinking sand. Winning would come later. In the form of not looking over my shoulder. In the form of waking up without rehearsing what-ifs. My parents invited me to dinner. We hadn't all sat together since before Jeremy's lie unraveled. I brought wine. My father grilled salmon. My mother wore the pendant I gave her years ago and set the table with real linen. We didn't talk about him. We talked about the garden, the weather, the price of eggs. But there was a quiet pride in the way my father poured my glass, the way my mother looked at me when she thought I wasn't paying attention. After dinner, she handed me a box. Inside was my grandmother's ledger. Her handwritten budget book, kept for 30 years. Notes in the margins. Grocery lists. Home repairs. Income and outflow in neat pencil. I ran my hand over the cover. She said, "You remind me of her." That night, I slept without dreams. No flashbacks. No revisions. Just breath. Even. Uninterrupted. The next morning, I woke early and opened the ledger. I read it from cover to cover, not for numbers, but for her voice. There was one entry near the back. Spent $4.25 on fence post repair. Necessary to keep things out, but also to remember where the edges are. Boundaries matter. That sentence stayed with me the whole drive home. Back in the city, I packed up Jeremy's last few belongings. I dropped them off at his friend's place with no note. No drama. No performance. Just return to sender. Then I changed the locks one final time. And I took a long shower with the window open. The city noise washed in. Alive. Constant. Mine. Sometimes healing feels like nothing at all. No epiphany, no catharsis. Just the subtle realization that you haven't thought about him in days. It came to me on a Wednesday. I was walking home from the corner market, a bunch of time in one hand and a folded newspaper tucked under my arm. I stopped at a red light and realized I'd passed the bank, the same branch where the loan had first appeared, and I didn't feel anything. Not dread. Not fury. Not even tension in my shoulders. It was just a building. And I was just a woman on her way home. Grief is strange that way. It recedes so slowly, you think it's part of the scenery. Then one day, it's gone. That weekend, I opened every drawer in the apartment and cleaned it with quiet intention. I donated clothes I hadn't worn in years. I shredded documents. I removed photos that once made me ache and let myself feel nothing. No nostalgia. No regret. Only space. I replaced the couch. It was the last major item that still held his imprint. I chose something firmer, smaller, a color he never liked. When it arrived, I spent the first night just sitting on it, sipping tea, letting my body memorize what unshared space felt like. The apartment was still the same square footage. But it felt bigger. My credit was slowly recovering. The last fraud notation had been lifted from my report, thanks to Erica's diligence and months of meticulous documentation. I framed the letter from the credit bureau and tucked it behind my grandmother's ledger. Not to display. Just to keep. Some victories don't need to be seen. Only remembered. I started running again. Nothing intense. Just loops around the park in the early morning, when the world hadn't quite woken up and the only sound was the rhythmic hit of my shoes on pavement. One morning, I passed a couple holding hands. The woman wore headphones. The man said something to her, and she laughed without pausing. He touched her elbow like it was the most natural thing in the world. It didn't make me sad. It made me curious. Not about him. About what I might still believe in. I wasn't ready for anything. Not romance. Not trust. But I was ready to no longer be angry. I found myself writing lists again. Not budgets or boundaries, dreams. I wrote, buy a place with natural light. Then, host a dinner where every guest makes a dish from their childhood. Then, wake up near the ocean, just once. The list grew slowly. Deliberately. Like everything I'd rebuilt. Lena stopped by one evening with a bottle of wine and 2 pints of ice cream. We sat on the new couch and didn't talk about work. She said, "You seem lighter." I replied, "I think I'm remembering how to want things again." She clinked her glass against mine. Later, when she left, I sat alone with the dishes unwashed and the windows open. A breeze moved through the room, carrying the city's noise and something gentler underneath. Maybe it was freedom. Maybe it was just quiet. I didn't need to define it. I took one last thing off my to-do list that night. I removed Jeremy's contact from my phone. Not blocked. Not archived. Deleted. He no longer lived in any system that belonged to me. The final detail came weeks later. A letter from the county clerk confirming the property deed had been amended. My name stood alone. Amanda Walker. That was enough. Not Mississippi. Not Mrs. Just Me. I walked to the waterfront that evening and stood on the pedestrian bridge as the sun sank into the river. People passed around me, couples, tourists, teenagers on scooters. I stayed still. Then I took out my phone and opened the Notes app. Added one more line to the list. Trust your silence. It knows when you're done. I stood there until the wind picked up and the streetlights blinked on. And then, without fanfare or second thoughts, I turned and walked home. No ending. Only continuation. And I carried myself forward, whole.